Tony D and Little Joan, and this is a video by request. Little Joan somewhere back there from Indie Phantom, and I thought I'd put this on the regular deal. How to write better comedy was the question in the live stream this Sunday, last Sunday, yesterday, and the kind of stuff Hollywood used to produce. So let's get into that. Smash like and subscribe. Thank you for smash liking and subscribing. Check out my books, the Pineys books 1 through 16. Speaking of comedy, available at Amazon.com. Don't forget, Kindle Unlimited is free. So, when you're writing comedy, it's all about the surprise. I know, it sounds very basic, but that's what you do. This is why it's so close to horror. Comedy is a good surprise, or a hilarious surprise, I should say, whereas horror is a oh God no surprise, right? A bad surprise, essentially. And so you need to surprise people. You need to surprise people. But what the comedies used to be everywhere in Hollywood. They used to put a ton in production, and one of the reasons they don't anymore, at least this is my theory, is it is partly due to the woke idiots, but also due to the fact that comedy doesn't translate into other cultures. You need a shared experience for the comedy to be funny. So, for instance, if you do a high school comedy, that works in America, but in Japan they have a different high school system. When you get to, I believe it's like the equivalent of 8th grade, you decide to take a path, and some kids go to trade school while others take a more college path. So senior year in high school kind of doesn't mean anything to someone in Japan who doesn't know America. So consequently, doing a comedy set in an American high school senior year, where a lot of them do take place, may not resonate comedically with a Japanese audience. So, because of that, comedies are limited in terms of the marketing. You can't sell comedies, American comedies, to a lot of foreign markets. Therefore, you're limited in the profit you can make. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't profit there. I believe there is, and I think people are thirsty for some comedies. But between that and the woke morons that they think are going to just trash the movie, Hollywood doesn't want to do it. Hollywood's become very corporate, even more so than back in the day. Back in the day, in the 80s, I remember a more freewheeling system. I would talk to producers, and a lot of them were just people who, they had some money, they decided to produce movies, or they had been in the movie business and then were trying to do their own thing, and it was kind of freewheeling in that way. If you produced something that was of quality, enough quality that you could put it on a screen and you could show it to a distributor and they would consider it. These days, everything's so corporate, everything's so studio run, it's very difficult to do that. And comedies are at the top of the kinds of movies that would have been freewheeling, because there's always a risk with comedy. The biggest risk, of course, is that you won't be funny. The second biggest risk is that the distributor might find it funny, but the audience won't find it funny. And another big problem is, because of all the woke morons, there aren't a lot of big name stand-up guys. It used to be back in the 80s and 90s, there were tons of big name stand-up guys. They would go to college campuses, which now they're petrified to do, by the way, because they're petrified of the students basically being in open revolt in the middle of their set. And, this is how If you remember Carrot Top made his fortune going to college campuses. I mean, he just did tour after tour on college campuses, and they're very lucrative. I mean, you can make a lot of money touring college campuses, or you used to be able to. Now, I don't know. I don't even know if even the college wants to book comedians because of the potential controversy. And there's always potential controversy in doing a comedy. There's not really any potential controversy in, say, doing a, let's say, horror movie. It's got scares. You can distribute it overseas. I mean, it has everything going for it. But comedies have everything going against it. So it won't translate overseas. Some people in the domestic market may be offended by it. And the worry is no one will go see it. However, it's the controversy that usually drives a comedy. Like, it would be that a comedy was so outrageous and so controversial, people would go to see it. But now there's just not that risk. So there's a lot of risk involved in doing a comedy. But how can you write better comedies that the studios would produce? It's not about the quality at a studio. They don't pick projects based on the quality. They just don't. I used to think that, and I would just say to myself, if I just keep working on my skills, if I'm just super funny, if my scripts are just really good, then they'll get bought. It just doesn't work that way. I was pitching ideas on the lot back in LA. This would have been like, I guess, 89 or 90. And this one woman let me pitch. She was a producer. And after I pitched a bunch of ideas, she said, some of those sound really good, but I'm the producer for Cheech Marin, and I need projects that Cheech can star in. And so she was only interested in that. So I didn't really have a project that Cheech would be right for. And what is the right project for Cheech Marin at that particular time? Well, it could have been a lot of things, but it would have had to have been aimed at a guy who was his age, looked like him. It would have to be the kind of project that particular star wanted to do at that time. So if he didn't want to do comedies anymore, and you had a bunch of comedies, you were out of luck. If you wanted to do something more serious, you needed to pitch him serious movie by Cheech Marin. So writing a comedy, you can do it. But the problem is, how do you sell it? But, and the other problem too is, sometimes comedy can be very topical, and that doesn't age well. So for instance, to give you an example, I wrote a screenplay, a zombie screenplay, but in it I made jokes about the Bush administration. But when I wrote it, it was the first Bush administration. And then later, the second Bush administration came in, and the jokes still kind of landed. But eventually, like, I would have to go back and do a rewrite on that screenplay. And it was a comedy zombie movie. So these days, the kind of projects you would want to write is something like that. Like a straight-up comedy probably isn't in the wheelhouse of most production companies or studios right now, simply because they can't sell them. So you want to kind of like do something that's two genres sort of crossed over, one of them being comedy, the other being whatever. Comedy horror, to me, is the most obvious choice, because you have the scares and the horror, and then you could have a bunch of one-liners of characters being smartasses in that crazy, scary situation. That's what Ghostbusters was, right? So you had the guys busting ghosts, but then you had some very serious supernatural creatures like Gozer. Like, you'll notice Gozer in Ghostbusters is 100% serious. There's no light moments with Gozer or her monster companions. She's there to destroy the world, and that's it. Um, so the kind of stuff you want to write is probably two genres. Rom coms come to mind. Um, you know, a straight up comedy like Airplane, it's going to be a real tough sell. It's going to be a real tough sell, no matter how funny it is. You know, you could turn in a airplane like script, and you know, I had plenty of people um, say to me, "Oh man, your script was really funny," and I'd be like, "Thanks, you want to produce it?" And they'd go, "Oh no." And I'd be like, "Why?" And they had their reasons. It was, you know, at that time there were different reasons. You know, I did a screenplay about the movie industry, which typically is something that the Hollywood studios love, but um, you know, most of the producers said, "Oh no, I couldn't produce that." They just didn't want to because they felt it was too biting against the movie industry, and that's a problem too because typically good comedy pisses people off, and you know, your targets, if you have the right target, right, and your target for comedy has to be, as they say, always punching up. So right now, what's the juiciest target? Still, it's the woke morons. They are perfect for comedy. You know, somebody who's, uh, you know, some bizarre gender and uses a bunch of crazy pronouns. I mean, this is what I made fun of in Wokistan, a novel, which I co-wrote, and Hollywoke, another novel, which I wrote, and that one's also about the movie industry too. So one of the running gags in Hollywoke, another novel, is the main character is a movie producer, and every time he goes back into the studio office, they have a new secretary, and each time the secretary gets more and more woke. So the first time he goes in there, I think the secretary's gay. The second time, and they keep replacing the secretary. So the second time he goes back in there, um, I believe the secretary is trans. Then it's a drag queen. Then it's a person who's paraplegic and can't actually work as a secretary in person and has to work via their iPad. I mean, it's just, you know, one crazy woke secretary after another that gets less and less useful to the job is the idea. Um, you know, no one in Hollywood right now would greenlight that. Not ever. Not right now. You know, maybe in 5 years, maybe if the book's a big hit and it suddenly starts burning up the charts on Amazon, maybe. Or maybe if the Pineys is a big hit and they're just looking for everything else. But as a satire, you know, even Wokistan, a novel, which is about a college that destroys itself through woke ideology, they're just not. They're just not going to make it. Not right now. We're getting closer and closer to a moment that maybe Hollywood will finally give itself permission, but they'll probably start doing movies about that, like anti-woke movies, I would call them. Probably long after the woke shtick is dead and buried. Um, you know, right now would be the perfect time to release a movie that satirizes woke idiots, but they're not ready. They're always way behind the times. The studios. Now, some young production company would maybe do it if I could, you know, hook up with the right people who had enough money to make a movie and enough interest in my work to do it. But it's tough, man. It's just very, very tough. So that's the main sort of thing with comedy. You need to target what is, you know, the hot thing, the appropriate target. Like right now, you could do. Let's say you did a big comedy was Spinal Tap. If you remember the Spinal Tap movie, and what did that parody? Well, it parodies the music industry and, you know, rock and roll guys. You could do another movie like that right now. Nobody would stop you, but they're not the big targets now. Rock bands are mostly gone. It's not like a big thing anymore. Um, you would have, if you wanted to parody the music industry, you would have to parody somebody like, some female pop singer like Taylor Swift, like her specifically, or someone like her. And she would be an appropriate target. But again, why? Well, partly because of her audience is mostly woke women. Um, so the kinds of things you need to write about and the reason you do that, the reason you target the woke, is because everybody can relate to how insufferable they are, and that's a universal theme. So another target would be, relationships. That's another universal theme that everybody can get behind. That's why I do a comic strip called In a Relationship that we, have been doing at the webcomic factory forever, and it just always works because there is endless material about relationships and, the downside of it or the craziness of it or whatever. And in a comedy, I always recommend using the tools of improv. So take an improv class if you really want to learn comedy. But in comedy, you always start as low as possible so you have somewhere to go. And then you kick it up in increments. So, for instance, in an improv scene, you would start with a suggestion, and then you would throw out what are called offers, and your scene partner would go, you and your scene partner would go back and forth. And as you're going back and forth with those offers, you're trying to listen for the patterns in your dialogue and your characters. And the key thing you say in those scenes is yes and. So in other words, you accept your scene partner's offer and you add to it. So for instance, your scene partner might say, this is a great day in the park. And now you know you're in a park and it's a beautiful day. You don't want to say, no, it's raining and I hate this park. You say, yes, and I also like the ice cream guy there. He's selling a lot of great ice cream. So now we know we're in a park, it's a nice day, and there's an ice cream guy. And it just goes back and forth like that, adding information about where you are and who you are and all that kind of stuff. So you do that with a comedy screenplay. You would start with a very basic premise. So, for instance, if you've ever seen the movie Dirty Work with Norm Macdonald and Artie Lang, and you should, it's a really, really quite a gem that I missed out when it came out. I think it came out in the late 90s. But the premise is Norm and Artie are two best friends, lifelong best friends, and they're both kind of losers and never really made it in life. But they get this idea for a business where they get paid to basically do revenge against people. You pay them to get revenge. And it's called Dirty Work, is the name of the movie. So they create this ridiculous business, and it starts out, the first act, they're just losers. And it sets up all the characters who will then later come back during the course of the movie and either hire them to do some of the dirty work or react to it. So I think one of the characters is, I think it's Artie's dad or Norm's dad, and he's a character and he's reacting to their idiocy. And then the second act is their various jobs. And of course, because they're getting revenge, most of their clients deserve to get revenge, right? They're, some little old lady who got ripped off and things like that. And they're getting revenge for them. But of course, it spirals out of control. But it does that in increments, going up the scale as Act 2 continues. It gets crazier and crazier until Act 3, they're in danger of being killed because I think they pull a prank against a group of cartel guys, and they eventually figure out what they've done and they go after them. I forget the plot of the movie. But it ends, you want to keep building and building and then push the concept off a cliff, which is what happens in the movie. So that's the kind of craziness you want for your comedy. You want to constantly kick it up until you get to the climax of the movie at the beginning of the third act, and then like every concept you want to just push to its nth degree, and have all sorts of payoffs that you set up in the first and early second acts. And that can mean many different things. If you read one of the Pineys books, you'll see I usually follow that pattern pretty closely. Let me give you an example. So book 8 of the Pineys is called The Roadkill Piney, and it centers around Route 55 in West Deptford, which they say is cursed. So the opening act is why is the road cursed? What's happening? And so what's happening is some sort of evil entity is messing with people who drive down Route 55, and they are either having terrible accidents or they are disappearing into the Indian burial mound that Route 55 is built through. So it starts out in the 80s, and one of the construction workers is pulled inside the mound and disappears. And so later, that construction worker comes back, and having been trapped inside the Indian burial mound for like 40 years. And during the course of the story, you find out the history of the mound, that Hemingway, when he was a teenager and hunting with his cousins, was near the mound, and he encountered the evil entity in the mound. It destroyed his Walkman, and then they ended up killing a different devil, and Hemingway insists that they killed the wrong devil, but nobody believes him, and they just go their merry way, and they never go back to the same spot until 40 years later. Eventually, during the course of the story in the second act, they are drawn to the area again because it ties into some of the origins of Milton, and some of the origins of Hemingway and Milton's relationship. When Milton was a kid, Hemingway left him at a Buddhist monastery to learn martial arts for a summer, and lied to his mother and told him he was at a summer camp. And the Buddhist monastery is near Route 55. So eventually they're hunting the devil that's popped out of the Indian burial mound that has been roaming South Jersey for like 10,000 years. And then, of course, there's a big confrontation at the end. And it ties into the martial artists, and it ties into everything I just mentioned. So the comedy comes out of, first off, it's pretty crazy and ridiculous, right? But the comedy comes out of how serious and monstrous the creature is that's causing all this mayhem on Route 55. People are dying and disappearing. Hemingway and Lewis basically get sucked into the Indian burial mound and have to somehow get out. And they're trapped there with the ghost of Aunt Colette, who died recently, and her immortal soul is now trapped in the Indian burial mound with them, and she has to escape as well. So, and on the outside, the rest of the cousins have to fight this evil entity without Hemingway and Lewis, who they need to defeat him. So the comedy comes out of Hemingway and Lewis being trapped, and the other relatives being sort of outgunned by the evil entity, and the craziness that keeps happening. And it's sort of over the top. There's a scene where a guy gets his head ripped off, and there's all sorts of crazy action with the Buddhist monks, and it's just very over the top. And that's what you want to put in your comedies. You want to put some of that over the top stuff. You don't want to do anything halfway in a comedy. You may do something not as extravagant in the beginning, but by the end of the story, you should be pulling out all the stops and just doing crazy stuff. Again, you want to kick it up in increments. First act should be relatively normal stuff. Relatively. maybe you have to hint at some craziness that's to come, but you want to keep it pretty damn low and neutral. When you get into the second act, that's when it really starts to kick up. Each thing, each event in a story, especially in a screenplay, has to drive the story forward and increase the comedy, increase the tension, increase the conflict. Um, and by the third act, it all comes to a head, and it should be, by that time, ridiculous. Another way to write comedy is to juxtapose reactions. And again, this is an improv exercise. We used to call it straight man, crazy man. The straight man would have the normal reactions, and the crazy man would have an emotion in the scene. For instance, you might have the emotion of fear, and then the straight man in the improv scene would offer up a location where you would not be afraid, right? So, for instance, you would do a scene in an amusement park, and that's a place where you shouldn't be afraid, right? But your scene partner has the emotion of fear, and so no matter what happens, each time something happens at the amusement park, he has to get a little more scared and a little more frightened until finally he's screaming and trying to get out of the amusement park because he's so scared. That's the kind of contrast you need in a comedy. A lot of times you want to make your characters do things that they absolutely hate. So if you mention early in a screenplay that your character hates, I don't know, cookies, by the end of the screenplay, he should probably be trapped in a cookie factory with no place, no way to avoid the cookies, right? Stuff like that. Or maybe he's hates the cookies because he used to be fat and he's very tempted by the cookies, and he's always stayed away from cookies. And then towards the end, they end up crashing through a window, and he finds himself in the middle of a giant cookie factory, and he's like, "Oh no!" So stuff like that. You want to go big or go home when it comes to comedy. You also want to look at how jokes are built. Jokes are set up, a reaction, or punchline, and then the topper, right? So the setup is knock knock, who's there? The reaction is, or the punchline is, orange who? Aren't you glad to meet me? Right? So the topper might be, something else to do with orange. I don't know. It's like an additional joke. So you want to kind of set up your comedy like that. So the first act is the setup phase. The second act is the reaction phase. And then the third act is the topper phase, where you get the big punchline. So this is how you write comedy. Now, I could give you specific examples, but they're not always funny when you start, as they say. Who said it? I think the guy who wrote Doonesbury said something like, comedy, analyzing comedy is like dissecting a frog. You can dissect the frog, but the frog is dead. So that's the hard thing about talking about comedy. It's kind of in the moment. It's kind of a product of its time. So this is why you don't see a lot of successful older comics, because it typically is a young man's game. You have to be young. You have to be in the zeitgeist. You have to, for me, being an older comedy writer, it's tough. They're going to want comedy based on things that are very current. So, for instance, if I was going to write comedy for a video game site, they would want me up on all the latest games. They would want me to be a Fortnite player and a guy who just knows current video games backwards and forwards, or otherwise, what am I going to write about? I haven't really played a video game in years. I think the last game I played was Fortnite, and I hated it. So, it's tough. Same thing with music. If you're going to write a satire about the music industry, or if you're just going to write a comedy where the main character is a pop singer, you got to know who's popular. You got to know Megan Thee Stallion and a few others. Even Megan Thee Stallion, I don't know. She kind of old hat now. Um, and a guy who's 58. Oh, it's tough. I would have to know the music better, and I don't. So you kind of have to write comedy based on what you know. So I can write one as a shared experience for an older crowd, certainly. I could write a comedy about a guy who's in his 50s and maybe he's breaking down, his body's breaking down, or he's getting divorced, and he's having all sorts of problems. Like, yeah, that kind of stuff I could write because I sort of have enough experience in that area. I could write it. But, writing about something very, very current, it's tough. It's tough. And who does a comedy appeal to is another, factor in all this. It's going to tend to skew young. You want it to skew across the spectrum of people, which is why you want to make it a more universal concept, which is why, relationships are a really good thing. That's why high school is a really good thing. Again, just because it's only going to be in America. Because everybody goes to high school. Everybody's in relationships. Everybody wants to get a job. That's another thing, trying to get a job. So these universal concepts are where you want to center your comedy. So the comedy itself has a good shelf life. If you want to do a comedy about someone who worked on the Trump campaign, well, that ship has already sailed. Trump's already elected president, and so the campaign's over. You could maybe try to sell a comedy about the Trump administration. However, you only have about 4 years, and then that's over. So being too current, well, you're going to have to write it and sell it fast. So, yeah, these are the pitfalls of comedy. My suggestion to you, if you want to write a comedy screenplay, you need to be doing stand-up. Get your comedy street cred in order. Even if you're just doing open mic nights, it doesn't matter. If you've never been paid, it doesn't matter. But if you're doing open mic nights and you're doing comedy on a semi-regular basis, maybe you're in an improv group, that's always very helpful regardless. You need to have some comedy bona fides to even do it and expect to sell the story to anybody. Otherwise, I have comedy credits, so I rest on my comedy credits. I don't have to necessarily be a working stand-up comic, although that would help me sell a comedy screenplay. But again, the market is just not really there right now. You want to kind of like hide your comedy again in another screenplay, so it's like it's a horror comedy, and then they're like, okay, it's basically a horror movie with some comedic elements. And if you look at some of the trailers I've looked at, some of them are clearly, to me, meant to be comedies, but they're actually downplaying the comedy aspect and playing up the other aspect, whether it's a romance, horror, or whatever. So it's tough. It's tough out there to write a comedy, but I hope these tips were helpful, and thanks to Indie Phantom for making the request. If you have a request for screenwriting tips, please feel free to make a suggestion in the comments section. I am happy to take requests, especially for screenplay tips, and I'm happy to explain my great wisdom. See these gray hairs? I got them for a reason. Anyhow, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you tomorrow.